I'm gonna hit that Oregon Trail this coming fall. Hit that Oregon Trail this coming fall, where the good rain falls aplenty and the crops and orchards grow. I'm gonna hit that Oregon Trail this coming fall. Well, my land is dry and Franklin.
Is this on? Hello. I think I see a few stragglers, but all right. Everyone has been so patient and such early arrivers. Really appreciate you all being here tonight. My name is Shauna Gandy. I'm the library director at the Oregon Historical Society, and I have the great pleasure of being the project director for this project and watching it unfurl before my eyes. On behalf of the Oregon Historical Society, I want to thank you for joining us for our 5th and final program that we've been taking around the state on Oregon conservationists William and Irene Finley and Herman Bohlman. The Oregon Historical Society preserves our state's history and makes it accessible to everyone in ways that advance knowledge and inspire curiosity about all the peoples, places, and events that have shaped Oregon. That's our mission, and I think our mission is reflected very well in tonight's program. And this program is part of a year-long collaboration between Oregon State University Special Collections and the Oregon Historical Society Research Library. And the main work of this project is to digitize the photographs and documents of William Finley and Herman Bohlman and Irene Finley, and to unite them all online. And that's about 6,000 or 7,000 photographs and about 8,600 pages of documents. And they're being loaded up online. We have a brand new website called digitalcollections.ohs.org. And if you want to take home one of these fancy postcards to remind yourselves to look on there, you can look at high-resolution images. We're just getting them loaded on now. We'll continue to do that throughout the month. And then the documents will follow. So take a look. You can zoom in and really see detail too. It's fantastic. And then also they're available on OregonDigital.org, which is OSU's digital collections website. Right, so I'd like to thank First Congregational Church for allowing us to use this space and being such great hosts to us. And especially thanks to the Audubon Society of Portland, who've been really wonderful partners in developing and delivering these programs and promoting them. And I'd like to welcome all of the Audubon members who are in the audience tonight. Can you just give me a show of hands of all of you who are Audubon members? Wow, that is fantastic. And OHS members, can you outdo them? Okay, how about both OHS and Audubon? Okay, great, thank you. Okay, and then we've also, in the other 4 programs that we've done in Burns and Klamath Falls, in Corvallis, and in Netarts, we have partnered with the National Wildlife Refuge System, and they have offered nature walks in each of those locations, and that has just been a wonderful partnership. So just want to acknowledge them for all that work that they've done with us. And then also, if I didn't harass you when you came in the door, there's a sign-up sheet in the back, and if you put your email address down, we can send a survey. And this is a federally funded project, so evaluation is really important, and we also just appreciate having feedback so that we know how to improve our programs going forward. There's also a paper copy, and I'd like to point out that it has 2 sides. So if you prefer paper, please fill one out and just leave it with us before you go. So, all right. Sorry, this is long. I also would like to acknowledge our funder. The project is supported in part by the Institute for Museum and Library Services through the Library Services and Technology Act, which is administered by the Oregon State Library. This is really important funding for libraries all around the country. Each state has these funds that are designated for their state and for projects that are important to libraries. So we hope that that funding continues. Now to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker tonight is Laura Cray. Laura currently serves as archives specialist at the Oregon Historical Society, and she's the main project person on this grant, digitizing all of the photographs for the grant. And we are really lucky to have Laura. She's the perfect fit for this project. She has a Master's of Arts in the History of Science from Oregon State University, and she also has a Master's in Library and Information Sciences from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And Laura is interested in the challenges of preserving scientific materials and also in the development of digital collections. And then as an academic, her scholarly interests lie in the history of natural resources management, so perfect fit. And Laura will be followed by Bob Sallinger from the Audubon Society of Portland. Bob serves as the conservation director, and he's been at the Audubon Society for 25 years. He also is an adjunct professor at Lewis and Clark Law School, where he graduated from. He's also a graduate of Reed College. And I really feel strongly that Bob's advocacy work continues and honors the work of the Finleys and Bohlmans. And so I think he's a really fitting representative to be here tonight. And yeah. And he's got a great following, so there you go. And tonight we have two really special guests who have not appeared at any of our other programs. We are really fortunate to have Worth Mathewson and Tom McAllister. And they're going to join Bob on a panel discussion at the end of the program. Worth is the author of the biographical photography book about William Finley called William L. Finley, Pioneer Wildlife Photographer. He's written articles for 43 different publications, authored or compiled 12 books, and he's the field editor for Delta Waterfowl magazine, so he's a busy guy. And he first became aware of Finley and Bohlman's work from the book American Birds, which he got for his 6th birthday. And I have to say, he's not the first person that I've heard about in the course of these programs who was inspired and interested in Finley because of a gift as a child of that book, American Birds. So clearly it's been very influential. Right. So Worth began researching Finley's life and work after moving with his family to Oregon in 1956. And last, but certainly not least, Tom McAllister. Tom is a native Oregonian who got his start in birding at a young age. In 1938, he began attending lectures of the Oregon Audubon Society, which was the precursor to the Audubon Society of Portland. And those lectures frequently featured William Finley. He and his friend David Marshall shared an interest in nature studies and took extended bicycle camping trips around the state, kind of like Finley and Bohlman. McAllister worked as a volunteer with John Scharf at the Malheur Wildlife Refuge in the summer of 1942, and also at a fire lookout on the Fremont National Forest. At the age of 16, he had his first paper published in the Elk. McAllister served in the Navy, and he was stationed in the Philippines during World War II. He also attended Oregon State University to study fisheries and wildlife management. And then after graduation, he worked for the Game Commission, which is now Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. He left the commission to write as an outdoor editor for the Oregon Journal and the Oregonian newspapers. And his column, Wide Open Spaces, was a fixture in the Portland papers, and even in retirement, he remains active and is an avid outdoorsman and naturalist. So we're lucky to get him indoors tonight. So now, at last, I give you my colleague Laura Cray and Hunting Wild Birds with the Camera.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see everyone here tonight. Just a second, I'm going to switch over to the actual presentation. And just for a little idea of how the presentation is going to go tonight, my plan is that I will give you a very, very brief overview of the history of William Finley and Irene Finley and Herman Bohlman and their work in the state. And then I will hand things over to Bob Sallinger, who will talk about how the Audubon Society is continuing that legacy today. And then we will end with the panel presenters at the end. So it's going to be an ambitious schedule. So hopefully we can get through it all. It has been an absolute honor for me to be here this evening, but also just to have had the opportunity to spend this past year working with the materials of this amazing group of naturalists and photographers. I've really come to appreciate the work of William Finley, Herman Bohlman, and Irene Finley, and it is my pleasure tonight to share just a small fraction of my favorite photos from the 6,000 images that we now have digitized in our collections. And so without further ado, let me get one more thing set up here, and then we will get started. Okay. From an early age, William Lovell Finley had a marked fascination with birds. Reflecting back on his childhood, Finley reminisced that when a boy, I had watched the wedges of geese cutting southward each autumn, and the other flocks of wildfowl winging silently on their way. Each spring, I saw the bands returning, how these sights kindled my imagination, these processions so full of mystery that moved up and down the highway of the clouds. The lands where these flocks lived lured me like the castles of Spain. It was a lure I have never forgotten. It was deeper than childish fancy. Now, after many years of waiting, I stood looking out over this land of innumerable flocks that had lain far beyond the northern rims of my home hills. The mysterious passage of these birds remained fixed in Finley's mind into adolescence and inspired him to venture forth into the field in search of their destinations. Finley's earliest foray into ornithology, the scientific study of birds, was as a collector of bird skins and eggs. During high school, he established a steady side business selling the specimens he collected to A.B. Averill, a Portland-based dealer of scientific specimens and curiosities. Finley quickly found camaraderie within the ornithological collecting community, and in 1894, he helped to form the Northwestern Ornithological Association. Not long after this time, however, Finley shifted his stance away from collecting, following trends in a national sentiment and his personal observations of declining bird populations. Finley disavowed the practice, arguing that the satisfaction of life is in the living, not in death, which is said to bring its reward. To this end, Finley was an early adopter of the camera as a means of scientific collection. Inspired by John James Audubon's iconic paintings in The Birds of America, Finley set out to attempt capturing every species of bird in North America on film. As it turned out, camera hunting also proved to be a most thrilling sport as well. Finley notes that, so in the chase, the camera tests the metal more than the gun. Success is more difficult, reward is more lasting. It is a truer sport, where once there was the desire to possess the skin of every bird, one finds himself set with eagerness to photograph these creatures at home, and fancy grows so strong that it fastens one's soul in a grip that makes the hobby an essential part of his life's aim. Finley was quick to recognize the power of photographic image, and throughout his life, he effectively used photography as a tool to advance his work in conservation. On many of Finley's trips into the field during those early years, he was joined by his childhood friend and neighbor, Herman Bohlman. He followed Finley into the collecting business and was an enthusiastic adopter of photography. Of the two, Bohlman is often credited with having the more artistic eye behind the lens, and some of the most iconic images to come from their collaboration bear only Bohlman's name on the copyright. The two frequently began heading off together, cameras in tow, for longer and more remote photographic hunting expeditions. Between 1899 and 1908, Bohlman and Finley photographed and wrote about thousands of birds on expeditions throughout Oregon and California. The images taken around Portland during this time possess a strong artistic eye and reflect a remarkable sense of intimacy and connection with their avian subjects. One can only imagine the amount of patience necessary to capture not just one, but 6 kingfishers posed on the same branch at the same time and looking in the same direction. Or the rapid fluttering of a hummingbird's wings as it draws nectar from a geranium blossom held in the photographer's hands. Their photography became a frequent feature in the Sunday Oregonian, which ran photo essays and line drawings arranged by Bohlman, with short articles about their adventures in the field written by Finley. Their early expeditions to photograph the bird colony on Three Arch Rocks off the Oregon coast near Oceanside were a particularly formative experience for the pair. While camping on the beach, waiting for favorable tides to get out to the rocks, Finley and Bohlman witnessed the Tillamook-based tugboat, the Vosburg, steaming slowly around the rocks to allow paying customers to pass their afternoon in the sport of live target practice. As the guns fired onto the nesting colonies, Finley later reported back to the Oregon Audubon Society that the beaches at Oceanside were littered with dead birds following the Sunday carnage. Witnessing the indiscriminate shooting aboard the Vosburg only further cemented Finley's desire towards conservation. With the work of Finley and like-minded Audubon Society conservationists, the model bird law was passed in 1903. With it, the shooting parties around Three Arch Rock were finally put to an end, and Audubon wardens were assigned to protect the bird colonies. The more time Finley spent observing and photographing birds, the more he realized the impending threat that unregulated overhunting was having on the once populous bird colonies he visited around the state. While some of the threat came from sport hunters, such as those witnessed on the Vosburg at Three Arch Rocks, Finley recognized that the real threat was actually the continuation of unchecked commercial plume harvesting. The turn of the century witnessed a trend towards increasingly ornate feathered hats in women's fashion. In previously remote places like Malheur and the Klamath Basin, where egret and grebes nested in the thousands, this whim of fashion meant an easy fortune for anyone with a gun. Everywhere Finley and Bohlman traveled, it seemed the plume hunters were a step ahead. Describing the scene of coming upon a grebe colony days behind the plume hunters, Finley described the sight before them. I saw a grebe mother that had been shot and not been found by the plume hunters, a mother lying dead beside her home. In a small bunch of tules, I saw a grebe baby trying to crawl under its dead mother's wing. Cold, helpless, starving. I can hear him yet. Here was a great cemetery in the silence of the marsh. One of the greatest challenges in addressing the decimation of bird populations by plume hunters was in winning over popular sentiment against the trends of the millinery industry. To the largely apathetic general public, it made little sense to be concerned about the adornment of a woman's hat. Here again was an opportunity for photography to reveal the invisible cost of the plume trade. Earlier expeditions into the Klamath Basin during the 1890s documented the density of bird colonies sustained in the region's lakes, particularly Lower Klamath and Tule lakes. Earlier reports by Audubon agents suggested that plume hunting was already impacting populations. William Dutcher, head of the National Association of Audubon Societies, sent Finley and Bohlman to photograph the region in 1905. They encountered no plume hunters during their summer on the lake, but the signs of their work were evident in the empty colonies left behind. Easy access to the railroad, and by extension San Francisco, turned the Tules into gold. In the summer of 1903, it is estimated that plume hunters harvested upwards of $30,000 worth of plumes, which is the equivalent of about $778,000 today. Shocked at the rapid rate of harvest, Finley and Bohlman set out to explore the lakes, capturing both the emptiness of the shot-out colonies and the beauty of life still there for the saving. William Dutcher again sent Finley and Bohlman back into the field in 1908. This time, they spent 5 weeks exploring Malheur Lake in search of the once plentiful white egret. Despite the fact that local ranchers reported that the primary plume hunting activity on the lake was nearly 10 years before, in 1898, Finley and Bohlman were only able to find 2 lone egrets during their entire stay. Yet again, the plume hunters were 2 steps ahead. Armed with their reports on the findings at Malheur Lake, Finley and Bohlman redoubled their efforts to attract public attention to the plight of plume hunters. Finley and Bohlman didn't just take photos of birds on their trips into the field. They themselves became the subjects in a large number of their plates. They invite the audience not simply to passively enjoy photographs of beautiful bird life, but rather to join them on their adventures. While sometimes a third photographer or ornithologist joined them and took photos, most of the images containing both Finley and Bohlman were self-portraiture. Throughout the presentation tonight, I encourage you to keep a keen eye out for the telltale string stretched from the camera. And in this one, let's see if I can get this to work from this angle. It's right here. You'll start seeing it. It shows up quite a bit. Sometimes they're better at disguising it than others. Reflecting the humor and excitement of the young photographers, these portraits show a spirit of adventure and daring the pair must have felt on their forays around the state. They took us pantsless over the river, still in their suit jackets and hats, of course, and through the tules, mosquito nets in tow. They showed their readers just how harrowing it was to capture those images of bird life up close and personal. And seriously, the next time someone is injured in a tragic selfie accident on the news, just remember how much harder it was to get selfies 100 years ago. Their images also illustrated the challenges of remaining in the marshes for so long. The pair took pictures of nearly every aspect of their life afield. And I do mean every aspect. For your sakes, I've left the bathing on natural photos out of here, but if you go online, they're... On the lower Klamath Lake, Finley and Bohlman struggled to find places to even exit their boat, noting that the whole border of lower Klamath Lake is an impenetrable jungle. Tules grow from 10 to 12 feet high. The foundation is made of decaying vegetation and is treacherous to walk upon. One may walk across the wavy surface, but at any moment he is likely to sink in over his head. These days were full of hardship. The water on the lake contained so much sediment and alkali that it had to be boiled. The first morning out, we tried wetting down the tules and making a small fire on top. But before we could get anything cooked, the whole foundation was ablaze, and coffee pot and frying pan had to be used to check the flames. Similarly, frequently, even basics like finding a dry spot to lay their heads for the night proved to be a challenge. On their expedition to Malheur, the pair struggled to find safe resting places. At one point, they took to bedding down on a tule raft made from a muskrat den. The thick growth of tules made an excellent mattress. By spreading out sleeping bags on top of a high bunch and rolling in carefully, we generally had a good bed for the night. In the early part of the evening, we were 2 or 3 feet above the surface, but by morning we had sunk down to just about water level, so yeah. A good alarm clock, I guess. Similarly, Shag Rock offered equally inhospitable lodgings, forcing Finley and Bohlman to carve out a narrow ledge to camp upon during their stay, and to precariously balance their tripods on the slick ocean rock faces. The Sunday Oregonian photo essays and short articles published about their adventures were popular amongst readers. However, there was one particularly important set of eyes whose attention was captured by Finley and Bohlman's work. President Theodore Roosevelt first encountered Finley and Bohlman's photography early in his presidency as he began surveying for naturalists who might be useful advisors in the development of his conservation policies. Bohlman's photography on Three Arch Rocks, paired with Finley's accounts of the danger the colonies faced due to the sport hunting, inspired Roosevelt to name the waters surrounding the rocks the first bird refuge on the West Coast in 1906. The images and Finley's activism on the subject again pushed Roosevelt to name the Klamath and Malheur bird refuges in 1908. In his book entitled Sanctuary, Sanctuary, Dallas Lore Sharp muses poetically about the foundation of Three Arch Rocks. Swinging their dory from her rocky davits, they launched her empty on the topping waves, loaded in their precious freight, and pulled safely off, headed for shore, making a solemn promise to the old bull sea lion and to the flippered herds sprawling along the edges, and to the flying flocks that filled the air. But none of the multitude heard it above their own raucous screaming, and none of them knew. They did not know how that vow took one of the boys across the states to the other ocean shore. They did not see the pictures of their rainy, sea-washed home spread in high excitement over the table in the White House, nor watch an eager man, all teeth and eyes and pounding fists, swinging about and bellowing, "Bully, bully," just like an old bull sea lion. But Finley did. They did not see him study the pictures and vow, "We'll make a sanctuary out of Three Arch Rocks." But Finley did. As all good things must come to an end, the marriages of Finley and Bohlman in the latter half of the 1910s marked the end of the two men's carefree months afield. Nellie Irene Barnhard met Finley when both were students at the University of California, and the couple married in 1906, and following which they moved to Oregon, where William had purchased a plot of land south of Portland at Jennings Lodge, a site that had long been a favorite for his wildlife photography and collecting. Their family expanded quickly in those early years, with the birth of Phoebe Catherine in 1907 and William Jr. in 1908. Not even the move, home construction, or the birth of two children was enough to slow the Finleys down. As Herman Bohlman began to take on greater responsibility in his family's plumbing business and spending less time in the field, Irene Finley stepped in as William's field partner. And I think it is worth noting, as this photograph of Irene carrying equipment and glass plate negatives up a cliff illustrates, that anything Finley and Bohlman could do, Irene could do in a skirt and heels. In a 1946 letter to William Finley in honor of his 70th birthday, Arthur Pack wrote the following tribute to Irene and her contributions to their partnership. "You've always had a partner in your enterprise, Bill, who has never failed you. There has always been a byline on your pictures by William L. and Irene Finley, and I know that you would wish her to share with you this token of appreciation from your fellow leaders in the cause to which both of you have dedicated your years. Your deeds are hers, and hers are yours." And I just kind of like to pause here and point out, in case you can't see, that's Irene there with the camera, and then Phoebe is in the middle, and then William Jr. is on the end there. But hiding right next to Phoebe is Spot the Wonder Dog, or Pete, sorry, his name's Pete. I don't know why I'm saying Spot. He's Pete. He becomes a character fairly later on during the Nature magazine years. They write a lot about him. So you'll see him again later. 1911 marked a year of key transition for Finley. His advocacy for Oregon's birds put issues of overhunting and habitat destruction to the forefront of public consciousness. At the behest of Oregon Governor Oswald West, Finley took on a central role in the formation of the state's first Fish and Game Commission. The commission recognized the state's increasing role in enforcement of game laws and the management of key fish and game species. With Finley acting at the head as state game warden, the state appointed a network of regional game commissioners and 40 wardens to monitor conditions and enforce federal and state regulation in the field. Finley set to his new position with the same level of vigor shown in his past pursuits. The most prominent project of his first year was the widely publicized effort to transplant elk from Jackson Hole in Wyoming to Billy Meadows in the Wallowa Mountains. In an effort to address overhunting and the near extinction of elk populations in the state, the Biological Survey of the Department of Agriculture donated a herd of 15 wild elk. To help pay for the journey, Elks Lodge members raised $351, and the residents of Wallowa County raised the final $181.25. In early March of 1912, the elk were loaded into specially built sleighs, and the team set out on an arduous 2-week journey from Wyoming to the Wallowa Mountains. Newspapers covered the herd's progress, as they moved westward by sleigh, wagon, and train. As they traveled through towns along the route, crowds came out to catch glimpses of the elk. After their release in Billy Meadows, communities throughout the state continued to follow the elk, with newspapers giving regular accounts of births, deaths, and other goings-on within the herd. In one such event, particularly apropos to the drama of the day, two bull elk named Teddy and Taft dueled for dominance of Billy Meadows. As the resulting report in the Eastern Oregonian noted, on account of his marked aggressiveness, the betting favored Big Stick Teddy, but Taft got in the solar plexus blow and Teddy joined the Ananias Club in Elk Heaven. The drama echoed the ongoing feud between lifelong friends turned political rivals Theodore Roosevelt and William Taft for the 1912 Republican presidential nomination. The May 1912 issue of Punch magazine, coincidentally, also ran an editorial cartoon of what I can only assume is a true-to-life representation of both the confrontation of Teddy and Taft, the elk in Billy Meadows, and Teddy and Taft, the candidates for that year's Republican National Convention. During his time as game warden, Finley never forgot the essential role of public support in sustaining momentum. Just as with his efforts to establish wildlife refuges and turn the public sentiment against plume hunters, photography and media outreach remained an essential tool in Finley's arsenal. That the fate of the Billy Meadows elk was tracked so closely in the newspapers was an intentional component of Finley's campaign to educate and win support for a new era of stricter hunting and land use regulation. To further the educational mission of the Game Commission, Finley started the Oregon Sportsman in 1913. Content for the magazine was provided by Finley, along with submissions from fellow wardens and interested naturalists. The Oregon Sportsman featured articles on new game laws, safe shooting practices, and practical how-to advice on a range of hunting and fishing topics, as well as serving as a platform for promoting ongoing commission projects. Despite the initial effectiveness of Finley's educational campaign, the role of state game warden was frequently marked with frustration. For Finley, the realities of running a statewide bureaucratic agency were both a distraction from his actual interests and his time in the field. He also struggled with the intricate politics of pleasing both the sportsman and the conservationist. In an effort to secure more time in the field and to alleviate some of his administrative duties, Finley was reclassified in the position of state biologist. This worked for a time, but in 1919, Finley was abruptly fired from his post at the Fish and Game Commission with little explanation. Despite widespread shock and outrage for the firing of Oregon's beloved naturalist, it seemed that politics had finally won over. Officially, incompatibility was the only reason cited by the state. However, Finley's tendency to focus on non-game species, coupled with his vocal opposition to ongoing irrigation projects in the Klamath Basin, were likely motivating factors. Freed from his administrative burdens that had so frustrated him during the last decade, Finley and his wife Irene were able to refocus their attention on their writing. Finley started his career as an author at an early age, publishing regularly for local ornithological societies, lifestyle magazines, and newspapers throughout college and after. Now, however, he was afforded the time to fully pursue his writing free of political constraints of state office. During their lives, William and Irene published 3 books and wrote articles for several prominent publications, including National Geographic, Ladies' Home Journal, The Atlantic Monthly, Life, Collier's, and Field and Stream. However, it is their close partnership with Nature magazine that most defines this latter third of Finley's career. In January of 1923, the American Nature Association launched the first issue of their official publication, Nature magazine. The magazine marketed itself as an illustrated monthly with popular articles about nature. Under the editorial leadership of Arthur Newton Pack, the magazine quickly became a favorite of households and libraries. A quick glance through the pages filled with articles, photography, and artwork from some of the nation's top naturalists, and it is little wonder why. Finley's photography first appeared in the 4th issue of the magazine, along with an article on the marshes of Malheur. By 1925, he was listed as the official naturalist and lecturer for the association. The magazine quickly became a platform for Finley to share from his lifetime of work in nature photography. It also allowed him to become a voice in some of the pressing conservation issues of the early 1920s. With titles such as Reclamation versus Conservation, Salmon or Kilowatts, and The Passing of the Marshlands, many of these articles addressed the ongoing struggle to balance development and water management in an increasingly industrialized world. In one article, he wrote to protest the 50-cent bounty on the hunting of the American eagle by the Alaskan Territorial Legislature to protect salmon runs. No longer do these wild birds, living emblems of American liberty, float above forests, streams, and shorelines, Finley declared. If the slaughter is kept up, your children and mine may never have a chance to see a living eagle. His is approaching the point of final disappearance. Are the American people to be represented by a defunct species? Did our forefathers make a mistake? Under the auspices of Nature magazine, the Finleys and Arthur Pack also set out to promote the newly established national parks throughout the West. In the magazine, Finley and Pack extol the virtues of the natural parks as a destination for the increasingly popular recreation of auto camping, a hobby that happened to pair very well with photography. Pack suggests that while motor camping was a pleasure itself, it became doubly delightful when combined with camera hunting, which he argued was far more of a challenge and with more sustainable and lasting trophies than a traditional hunting excursions. During extended summer expeditions, the team would travel through Yellowstone and Glacier or around the Alaskan coast, gathering film and content for their next year's round of articles and lecture series. Not all of the contributions to the magazine by the Finleys were of such hefty subjects, however. William and Irene also became known for their articles recounting the antics of their many wild animal pets. Among the most well-known in the cast of characters were Dinty the porcupine and Don Q. Quail. Many of these articles also feature the intrepid family dog Pete as he learns to interact with the strange array of household guests brought home to Jennings Lodge. The photos and films of these strange creatures of the American West entertained children around the country as they looked into the pages of their Nature magazine each month to catch the latest glimpse of the animals featured in Mr. Finley's celluloid zoo. I'm not sure if you can see in the back, but that's Don Q. Quail perched on the top of that little girl's head. He is quite the character, and they took a lot of photos of him. So if you like quail pictures, we have hundreds, but just of one quail. Throughout his career, Finley, and to a lesser extent, Irene and Herman Bohlman, maintained an active calendar of public speaking engagements. To Finley, they were an essential component of educating and winning public support for conservation. Initially, these lectures were accompanied by glass lantern slides. These slides were hand-painted, many of them by Bohlman and Finley themselves, but also with help from other local artists such as Bruce Horsfall, the man who would later go on to paint many of the iconic covers of Nature magazine. This particular slide is of Finley's pet condor, the General, who he brought back from his 1906 photo expedition to document condors in California. The General lived free around Jennings Lodge and would travel with Finley to educate people about condors until he was sent to the New York Zoological Society. To this day, Finley and Bohlman's Condor series photographs are considered some of the best ever taken of the birds and were instrumental in building support for saving the species from extinction. As motion picture technology improved, Finley jumped at the opportunity to branch into film for his lectures. Finley thrived in his role at Nature magazine, writing and speaking for a popular audience, spending much of the late 20s and early 30s traveling around the nation promoting film lectures for school groups, social clubs, libraries, and audiences of all ages. The films also ran as shorts before feature films in theaters around the world for studios like Universal. In many of Finley's articles and films, wildlife is presented as cute, adorable human companions. As historian of science Greg Mittman notes in his book Real Nature, portraying animals as individual friends conform to the presentation of wildlife in national parks, such as bear shows at Yellowstone, and to prevailing attitudes towards the management and cultivation of prize game species. Motion pictures that were produced in the interest of conservation, nature appreciation, and promotion of the national parks before the Second World War also drew upon and reinformed the tame and comic characteristics of individual animals in the wild. On a 1928 expedition into Glacier Park in Montana, Finley and Pack took their efforts to photograph wildlife a step further than just hiding in a blind. They donned a white flannel goat costume complete with horns and whiskers. So, to our great fortune, Finley and Pack's goat antics were preserved in a 1930 Nature magazine short film called Getting Our Goats, and I just happened to have an excerpt of that along with a copy of their narration that they would go with it. They don't line up exactly, so you're going to have to bear with me a little bit. It's not perfect, and the image quality on this is not ideal. Oh wow. This is tricky to do. But without further ado, please enjoy an excerpt from Getting Our Goat. The northern part of the Rocky Mountain Range near the Canadian border is the most tumbled and twisted mass of peaks in the United States. A long time ago, the Earth's crust, thousands of feet thick, buckled up in wave-like folds as it cooled. This split the continent, forming a break of sheer cliffs on the east. Here is the home of the mountain goat. In this country, one has to use the old-fashioned one-horsepower motor. The fuel for such a trip may be out of date, but it is reliable. You can't pile things in, they have to be tied with a diamond hitch. Working up towards Bouldered Pass, we had to cut the trail across the snowslides to get safe footing. The trail had not been opened up, and a slip on the ice would land the outfit several hundred feet below at the bottom of the gorge. The tallest cliffs that drop from the roof of the Rockies are the haunts of the most expert steeplejacks in the country, called mountain goats, which we were hunting with a camera. Then, away up on the face of a cliff, we saw a white spot, which turned out to be a mountain goat. A goat likes to lie out in the open where he can see in all directions. We got a little closer for a shot with the long lens. But if you approach from below, the goat has all the advantage. He starts climbing and soon is out of sight. A goat is built for the country in which he lives. His hoof is rimmed like the steel on the outer side. The center has a rubbery pad, so when he plants his foot on the icy surface, it sticks. This is why he can leap from pinnacle to pinnacle in safety. One day, we came up over a ridge and, looking down, saw a nanny and her kid resting on a rocky ledge 200 feet below. When I poked the camera over and pressed the trigger, her ears pricked up as if she heard the buzz of a rattlesnake. We tried to climb down a little closer, but mother-like, she was suspicious and watching out for the safety of her kid. When a goat moves off, there's no use trying to follow. It is impossible to show the up and downness of this country with its sheer cliffs hundreds of feet high. A little later, we came to a place where you could look straight across at the steep cliff. As we watched, a goat appeared around the corner and, seeing us, started away along the side. At times, a goat moves along the face of a rock where the knobs do not stick out far enough where the knobs do not stick out far enough to hang a hat on. It may be safe enough for him, but it is risky for a cameraman. These goats were too wary and afraid of man. We had to play a goat to get a goat. A white bedsheet might serve as a disguise, but we also had to have chin whiskers. The strands of hemp rope, when combed out, served this purpose. The disguise looked nightgowny in effect. Here at the top of the continent, with the wind whistling over the rim, it was a question of whether we could fool the goat. The shape was not quite goat-like, and a goat depends upon his nose to warn him of danger. So if the goat was to the windward, the costume didn't have the correct goaty smell. From a distance, the bogus goat looks like a real goat. One could put the costume on, hold the camera close to his chest, and crawling along behind the rocks and across ledges, get nearer a goat than otherwise. But one had to be careful about meeting an old Billy weighing 200 or 300 pounds along a narrow ledge. There was a good chance of his thinking that a strange goat had invaded his legal domain. It was rather difficult to tell what was in the mind of a mountain goat when he saw this strange freak that suddenly appeared at the top of the universe. The color was right, the whiskers and ears were there, but the shape and actions were unlike anything that had ever appeared along the roof of the Rockies. An old goat that was moving along minding his accustomed ledge, minding his own business, had to stop every 2 or 3 steps to try and figure out the stranger. Sometimes it was a game of hide and seek. If one could get the advantage by surprising a goat from above, he was taken off his feet, as it were. For a few moments, trying to figure out what kind of cousin had arrived from the north. Another old billy goat, deceived long enough to get his picture. If that goat has any sense of the ridiculous, he does not show it. The last day, I was sitting among the clouds on top of one of the highest peaks when 2 goats were coming up a trail from the top. I remained perfectly quiet until they were within 50 feet. As I pulled the camera, they saw me, but I had the drop on them. A moment later, the whir of the camera sent them downward in a cloud of dust. All right. And with that, I am going to pass things over to Bob Sallinger, who is going to take a step forward and then a step back and then a step forward and talk about William Finley and how his legacy is felt in the Audubon Society today.
So good evening. First, I want to thank Laura and the Oregon Historical Society. They've done amazing work putting all of this online, and it's such a treasure trove of information. And really, you know, the history of conservation in Oregon. Finley did some amazing stuff. I wanted to start with this picture tonight. The caption that was on the back of it is a modern prairie schooner used for a 2,000-mile trip in Oregon. Herman Bohlman and William Finley driving to Bend to Burns in 1908 in a white steamer. The results of this trip created the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. Much of the land that we think about today as public lands in Oregon and Washington as well were the result of the work of William Finley. That includes Klamath, Malheur, and Three Arch Rocks wildlife refuges in Oregon, the first coastal wildlife refuges in Washington. It also includes many of our national forests. The majority of our national forests were the result of advocacy by William Finley. And so the legacy that we've inherited today of public lands in Oregon, in large part, is due to these gentlemen. William Finley really is the patron saint of the Portland Audubon Society. He founded Oregon Audubon, which was today Portland Audubon, in 1902 to serve as his advocacy arm for the purposes of protecting the first wildlife refuges in the West and passing the first bird protection laws. As you already heard, he was very concerned about the wanton slaughter of birds for the hat trade, for the millinery trade. And so he founded Oregon Audubon to serve as his advocacy wing. He also surrounded himself with some of the best naturalists, not just in the state, but in the entire country. It was really an incredible group of naturalists. And he, within the first 6 years, using Portland Audubon, Oregon Audubon, protected Klamath, Malheur, and Three Arch Rocks, and also passed the Model Bird Act. But a few years after that, they went on to fund the first game wardens at Klamath and to purchase the first boat for the game wardens to use at Klamath, named the Grebe, and I'll show you a picture of that later. The great ornithologist Roger Torrey Peterson talks about William Finley and noted that in the golden age of naturalists, at a time really in the early 1900s, really were the golden age of naturalists, William Finley probably only had one peer, and that is John Muir. And that really, I think, is accurate when you look at his legacy. In many ways, I view William Finley as the prototype for the modern conservation activist. He was an incredible naturalist, scientist, advocate, writer, photographer, educator, and adventurer. He was somebody who worked very efficiently within the system. In fact, he played a tremendous role in helping create many of the institutions that we know today as the wildlife agencies in this state. But he also was never afraid to take those agencies on. He was never afraid to go out there and fight those agencies, advocate, and push them when necessary. And he also never lost his connection to the land. I think sometimes we get into these policy battles in the modern conservation movement, and we forget what it's all about. And I think one of the things that Finley brought to this, and that I think we try to live up to today at Audubon, is this idea that we always need to have this connection to the land. Need to get out there and experience it, take people out there, help them understand it, love it, and if you do that, then they'll protect it. And really an incredible sense of adventure. If you look closely at these slides, you can see his tent is on that cliff on the right-hand side. That's where they camped at Three Arch Rocks. And I talked to a biologist recently that works out there, and he said that he tried to recreate this trip. He said it was the scariest thing he'd ever done in his entire life. Absolutely insane. If you look closely at this one, you'll see them standing in a tree up toward the nest, to the right of the nest. That's actually, they're standing up there filming, and that's how they got shots like that. And I think, you think back to the early 1900s, this was the first time people were seeing this kind of stuff. This was really revolutionary photography, unprecedented, bringing people up close and engaging them with nature. They also never lost their sense of fun and their sense of irreverency, and that's throughout their pictures and their writings as well. And I think that's something we always need to remember in the modern conservation movement as well, that we need to have fun. We need to enjoy ourselves. We need to get out there and enjoy what we're trying to protect. This is Bohlman, by the way, flipping pancakes. As I said, they were able to work inside the system very effectively. And in 1903, Teddy Roosevelt decided to do his great loop tour. He decided to take a couple of months off from being president and travel around the western United States and experience these places he had heard about. With an eye toward what did he want to protect during his presidency. He'd already established the first wildlife refuge in the United States in the East. He wanted to go west. And so the Great Train Loop Tour, he took a couple of months off and visited a variety of places. He went to Yellowstone with John Burroughs. He went to Yosemite with John Muir. He went to the Grand Canyon and was frustrated because he could only name 100 plant species, but 200 bird species. We should only have a president that's able to have that kind of ecological knowledge. He went to the Redwoods, and they named a tree after him. He was so offended by the commercialization of the trees, the idea that somebody would put a sign on a tree, that the only way he would let them name the tree after him was that they took all the signs down. And he came to Portland. And there's a story, and I'm going to stick with it even though it's debatable as to whether it's true, of Roosevelt coming into Portland, getting off the train, and you can imagine that he was a rock star. You can imagine the bandstand. This is a picture on the right-hand side of what it looked like. And apparently, as the band started to play and all the dignitaries were there, he shouted, "Get me Finley." And Finley came out of the audience, and they promptly left and went off to look at photographs of birds. Now, his grandson was in the audience the last time I presented this, and he came up to me afterwards. He said, "Bob, that's actually not true." But it's a damn good story. And Dave Marshall, who knew William Finley and is also a person who is intertwined with Audubon's history for decades and decades, his parents helped found Audubon along with William Finley, wrote about this and said it is true. So I'm going to stick with Dave's side, but maybe Worth and Tom can settle this for once and for all tonight. He knew that Roosevelt loved puffins, and so he brought him pictures of puffins. He went back to Washington. And these are hand-colored pictures, hand-colored glass slides. You can see the original on the left and the hand-colored one on the right. Another picture of a hand-colored glass slide. Really incredible stuff. And inspired Roosevelt to protect the first refuges in the West at Three Arch Rocks, Malheur, and Klamath. And in doing so, the Malheur and Klamath and Malheur were the first two inland refuges protected. All the rest had been coastal, and all of them had been very, very small. When he protected Klamath and Malheur, we started talking about refuges of tens of thousands of acres, so it was really a step forward. But all along, as they're doing this advocacy and he's working for the state, they're also building this cadre of people that care about nature. And I love the fact that he traveled around with the California condor, and there's all kinds of pictures of events of early Audubon Society with the condor hanging out. They're out on these picnics, hanging out, looking at plants, looking at birds, and the condors hanging around in the background, as in this picture. You can see some, I think this is at Jennings Lodge. You can see Irene hanging out in the hammock and the condor hanging out on the stump. And, I think that's something that is invested in the modern Audubon Society of Portland as well. We're not just about advocacy. We're about encouraging people to love, understand, and protect nature with the idea that if you don't have that love and understanding, any sort of advocacy, any sort of regulatory effort is going to be ephemeral, that it has to be foundational. And so I think this comes directly from William Finley. And it's embodied in events like Swiftwatch today. And by the way, I love Swiftwatch. We have problems with Swiftwatch, people parking on people's lawns, people peeing on people's lawns. Only in Portland would you have a rock concert scene where people are going out bird watching. I don't think it's an accident that Portland Audubon has the first wildlife rehabilitation center in the world, as far as we know. And by a number of decades, William Finley raised lots of animals at his house. There's all kinds of writings in his archives about raising bears and deer and bobcats. This is his son raising bobcats. And by the 1930s, we had a rehabilitation center at Portland Audubon. Again, as far as we know, the next most recent one would be 1970. And we actually have records to the board of rehabilitating animals in the 1930s. Amazing place, does 3,000 animals a year. And again, it's about connecting people, because connected to every one of the animals that comes in every year that Lacey and her crew work on is a person and a neighborhood. And if you can get them engaged, help them understand what's going on with those animals, you can also get them to help protect them. That's a bald eagle, by the way, being released in downtown Portland. You've already heard that William Finley was very, very concerned about the wanton slaughter of birds. And this is a picture of the grebe I mentioned earlier. This is the patrol boat they bought at Klamath. And this is some of the wardens that Audubon and Finley helped paid for at Klamath. We're still seeing those problems today, and many of the issues that he dealt with are issues that were still very germane today. Sadly, many of the fights that he fought, we're still fighting. This picture on the left is of a grebe that was shot for her feathers and her young on the nest. At the care center, we still see far too many animals that are illegally poached. Eagles, all kinds of birds of prey, herons. We've gone down to Salem the last several years and tried to pass legislation to increase penalties for illegal poaching. Sad but true, we're still fighting these same battles today. We're also unfortunately fighting wanton slaughter of birds by the federal government. For those of you who's heard about East Sand Island, federal government's killing 15% of the cormorants in the western United States because they eat fish. Who would have thought that cormorants would eat fish? So we've been fighting a long battle with the federal government to focus on the real problems. Don't kill the cormorants, fix the dams. He was an amazing advocate and propagandist in some ways. He was a guy, again, who worked inside the system, but also who shut down fishing companies that were shooting birds. He was a guy that caused an incident in downtown Portland, ripping feathers out of women's hats. Think about that in 1903. Think about that in 2017. This is a film he made. I'm not going to show it to you, but I love this film. It's Passing of the Marshlands. He was concerned about Klamath National Wildlife Refuge and the fact that they were converting the land and taking the water and using it for agriculture that didn't belong there, frankly. It's not a good place for agriculture. And they were draining the wetlands very, very quickly, the most important wetlands in the western United States. It starts out with these incredible pictures of the abundance there, just skies filled with birds. And this is a still from the film, so it doesn't look very clear, but incredible footage. And then he shifts to a dry lake, no birds, and a world of dust. A waterfowl refuge partially drained and leased to stockmen. And then he cuts to scenes like this. And this, a dry lake bed with a sign sticking up out of it. And sadly, we are fighting these fights today. This is Klamath today. That's a picture I took of a sign sticking out of a dry lake bed. Caution, deep water. If you like ironic signs, go to the Klamath National Wildlife Refuge. As a result of the fact that they have leased land farming on the refuge, not around the refuge, on the refuge, they lease the refuges down there for agriculture, to grow potatoes and onions. And they provide water to those agricultural lands while they let the lakes go dry year in and year out. And the water that is there gets stagnant, and we have disease outbreaks, and tens of thousands of birds die. That's a picture of all those lease lands, all those squares on those pictures. Those are refuge lands that are used for agriculture while the lakes go dry. So we sued them. And we're in the middle of litigation right now. Audubon's an organization, I think, like in Finley's day, that collaborates whenever possible, fights whenever necessary. This is a case where we're fighting. There's another case. He was worried about greed and the development of our public lands. At Steens Mountain, we just had a really big victory along with Onda, where we defeated a massive wind development that would have been visible from the Kiger Gorge. We're supporters of renewable energy, but it needs to be done right. It needs to be done in the right places. And even the greenest of energy sources can be done badly. So this is a fight we just won, and we're real proud of that. At Malheur, you've heard a lot about Malheur, but the story that really, I think, needs to be told is one of collaboration. At Malheur, invasive carp on the right here, it's a river otter eating a carp. You get an idea of how big they are. Have destroyed Malheur Lake. They've taken this incredible lake that used to be full of vegetation, full of sago pondweed, provided habitat that produced 180,000 waterfowl a year, and invasive carp have turned it into a black, murky, open water habitat that provides for nothing. Less than 10,000 birds a year are produced there, down from 180,000. So we've been working collaboratively with the refuge, Friends of Malheur, the Paiutes, and the local community ranchers to find a solution for this. I think it's one of the most important projects in the western United States, both from an ecological perspective, but also from a collaborative perspective. And that, to me, is the true story of Malheur, not what we heard about last year. It's a place where people are truly working together. And we're working on the next generation of wildlife refuges, building upon that legacy at the coast, trying to create a system of marine reserves, working with a lot of partners. The oceans are the next frontier for marine reserves, and we have 5 now, but in 2023, we're going to have the opportunity to create more. The legislature has delayed any new refuges until 2023, but at that time, they will expand the system, and we need to be ready for that date. We need to get ready now. He fought for species. He was worried about species declines. Today, we're still seeing that. 1 out of every 4 species in Oregon is experiencing significant long-term declines, like the spotted owl. We were one of the groups that sued to protect the spotted owl and the marbled murrelet under the Endangered Species Act in order to protect our old-growth forests and preserve this legacy for future generations. And we're still fighting that battle today. This is the next big battle when it comes to endangered species, the sage grouse. They chose not to list it a couple of years ago, but it's declining, and the implications of restoring this animal on our sage sea is even bigger than the implications of the spotted owl. And we're real excited looking forward to the return of the condors to the skies over Oregon. But in order to do that, we're going to have to ban lead shot. The reason condors decline and continue to be in peril today is because of lead shot. We don't need to use it. We have alternatives, and it's absolutely outrageous that we haven't taken that step and moved forward so that we can recover these birds and our kids can look up someday and see condors flying overhead. And there is reason for hope. I took this picture this morning. This is peregrine falcons on the St. John's Bridge. We were climbing on the bridge banding birds this morning. And they have 3 young this year. When I started Audubon 25 years ago, peregrines weren't overhead in Portland. They were still at the beginning of their recovery. But today, they have recovered, and we have the most productive nest sites in the state of Oregon in the middle of downtown Portland. So when we put our minds to it, we can recover these animals. And we have an unprecedented threat in front of us right now. Our public lands are under threat in a way that we have not seen before. Trump administration has very aggressively been going after public lands for development. We've seen the rise of groups that are trying to privatize public lands. We even seen it in Oregon. We just won a big battle over the Elliott State Forest, where the governor and others considered selling it off to private interests. Fortunately, they backed away from that. But today is the time to really get involved, and Steph, our volunteer, our activist coordinator, and Micah have a table in the back to sign up to become an Audubon activist. So if you're ready to fight for our public lands and our wildlife and our open spaces, please get involved, because we need every voice we can get. So I wanted to end tonight with a quote. William Finley, as you've heard, was fired by the Fish and Game Commission in 1919 for being too much of an advocate, basically. He was advocating for non-game species in Oregon. He was arguing that we were spending all of our money on species that were hunted and fished, but not species that were just out there for their intrinsic value and their ecological value. That's true today. Today, 2% of the budget goes to non-game species, and non-game species represent 88% of the species in the state of Oregon. Think about that. 2% of the wildlife budget in the state of Oregon goes to 88% of the species in the state. So William Finley was fired by the state for pushing too hard. And I don't think there can be a better epitaph for a true conservationist than to end their career by getting fired by the organizations they helped create for being too aggressive. So I wanted to read you a quote. When he was fired, the school children of Oregon had a Finley Day, and the Oregon Voter wrote, quote, "Finley's been canned." That was the expression that was used by hundreds of Oregonians last week when it became known that William L. Finley, popular state biologist, beloved genius, ardent naturalist, famous student of bird and animal life, nationally known scientist, lecturer, and writer, had been discharged from the state services by the Game Commission. So thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, it looks like we had an ambitious schedule for the evening, but we still have time for our panel. So now we're going to transition to our panel for the evening. So I suppose I should not fail in my job of bringing the microphone. Or should I use the ones in the back? These ones? I don't know where they went. But if we could have Bob Sallinger come up, but then also Worth Mathewson and Tom McAllister. Yeah. So I know that you've already heard from Bob Sallinger, but we're going to ask Tom McAllister and then Worth Mathewson to really quickly kind of give us an introduction to themselves and the ways that Finley was an influence on their lives, and then we'll open it up for questions to the panel if I'm sure anyone has questions. If you want to, do you want to stand or you can have a seat? It's up to you. Okay.
Tom McAllister. I think I'm the oldest standing member of the Portland Audubon Society. I joined in 1938. And that original meeting fashioned a good share of my career and life from that point there on. There was a young fellow there my age, David Marshall. He went to Washington, Mount Tabor area. I was in the Laurelhurst district, and we just hit it off. And we met the next day on our bikes and started out birding in the Columbia River bottoms, where you could still go down there and hear the yellow-tailed chats and so many birds that have faded away. But we had great adventures. And in the ensuing years, the Audubon Society, while I was at that young age, had all these activities centered out of the Multnomah County Central Library. And in those days, the programs were verbal, where you had a speaker with pictures and what we called the magic lantern, with the 3 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch slides, many of which were hand-colored. And Finley's artist was doing those hand-colored pictures with 2 ladies at his studio. And those members and the public packed the lecture hall at the Central Library so that the fire marshal came over and had to issue a warning. The capacity was, I think, 420 some, and you couldn't have any more. But it was attracting people right from the outset. And I took some notes while Bob was speaking and a few of the others, and I wanted to corroborate for Bob the damn good story. David Marshall's father was a truly brilliant individual. He was a civil engineer, and he knew the history of this state like no one else I have ever met. And I would sit there in the evenings thoroughly regaling by his stories of Oregon around the campfire and how it was. His grandfather landed as a drummer boy at Monterey in the Mexican War. Gold was discovered, and like most of the young fellers, skedaddled from the Army and head for the gold fields, and then on up to Oregon. So the family was deeply immersed in the state, as was David's parents. His mother, in particular, her family were amongst the earliest members, and they're taking me on trips with them, and all this is rubbing off on me. The Seaman family, David's mother's family, lived up on Summit Drive off of Talbot Road. And can you imagine, in the winters, when it was real winter in Portland, one of the gatherings was to go to the top of Council Crest, and there was a lot less in the way of big trees up there. You had a far better view, I assure you. And the Audubon Society was putting out grain, which was given by one of the local granaries, and feeding top of Mount Council Crest mountain quail, grouse, valley quail, and even occasionally a ruffed grouse. There was still a lot of old apple orchards scattered out, and it was a varied habitat. But to see the mountain quail up there in those times, and then the fascination thing was the Seamans were great collectors of Indian artifacts. And underneath the great porch on that old family home, David and I crawled under one time and discovered the wealth of Indian artifacts. You can't believe some of the mortars and pistols and camp rocks. Anyway, it was just one of the high points of my life, is being associated with those two families of David Marshalls. Now, the Stanley steamer that you showed on that first shot of yours, I think that's a very important part of Finley and Bohlman right at the outset, getting the distances they did in the time, but when they got there, not getting continually stuck and being able to carry all their equipment and get it out next to the marsh. You know, the Stanley steamer had clearance, but it didn't have other than a straight line to the axle, and you had a torque with power that was unending. And there's all these big all-wheel, all-terrain vehicles today. That was the original all-terrain vehicle. Yes. And one of the things that I particularly enjoyed when I came back from the service, I entered Oregon State, David and I together, in fisheries and wildlife management, and I immediately had a job working on lake and stream survey in the Cascades, and I liked horses and mules, and I said, that's for me, and I got the job on the pack string, and we were stocking the wilderness backcountry lakes, certain ones that had been surveyed as satisfactory for trout. But all that began with Finley's very close friend, Ed Averill, who was very active next to Audubon. One of the most influential conservation groups was the Isaac Walton League of America. And the chapters here in Oregon were exceedingly strong, well distributed, and they were at the beck of the conservation call when you had to get to the legislature or get a hold of legislators. Their meetings in Portland, the Portland chapter at the old University Club, they had some of the best of the speakers, but they could bring things and get them done. So here's Ed Averill, who's a fish and wildlife commissioner. They separated off the commercial fishery, and now it's the game fish and then the wildlife or game. And they, under Finley, his first couple of years, set up the Rainbow car, which was a Pullman car that was stripped clean, and they put in all the circulating water, the coolers, and they would transport the trout from where they held the fingerlings at the old Bonneville hatchery all around the state to the roadheads up in the mountains, and the local sports clubs would come down and pack the fish in. And then after that, they got their own pack string, and I was there in the last days of packing the lakes with 14 mules, 4 horses, a bell mare, and a colt. Did that for 3 summers, so I had the best of times. Now, Ed's daughter, by the way, was Connie McCready, one of the liveliest of our commissioners. And I used to take her salmon fishing with a combined group of Journal Oregonian writers. We'd have a big get-together out of Ilwaco, and she's the best fisherman I ever got around. And I'll wind this up in a moment.
Okay.
And you don't know that moose were brought to Oregon while Finley was the state biologist, and those moose were released down in the Taconich-Siltcoos area in exchange for elk traded to Alaska, which were put up on a Fognak Island. What happened to the moose is a fascinating story some other time. Well, after the lectures at Library Hall, the last lecture I heard of Finley, my father took me at the Isaac Walton held a big banquet to celebrate the life of Finley at the Multnomah Hotel. And Finley got up, and he was suffering with dementia. But he got through it with his wife behind him, assisting him. And the one thing he railed against the dams were just starting, and he said, the dams will end the salmon runs. And that was his last crusade. And those little vignettes are some of the wonderful background, and it'll keep coming out for a long time to come about this Finley and his wife Irene and the wonderful summer picnics the society had out there at their Jennings Lodge place. And then we had the big annual spring migration trip down to Oceanside, where they were 7 days waiting for the surf to subside to get out to Three Arch Rocks, and they would join those trips. So I got to hear them with the groups down there. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. And I'm really sorry that I had to cut you off. It was working. But now I think Worth wanted to, did you have a few anecdotes you wanted to add?
Yeah, hello. I hope all of you appreciate, you just heard the living Oregon historian on Oregon history. It's a great that you got to hear, Tom. There's nobody.
In my mother's arms, 1853 wagon train. I've seen it all.
I'll share just a very few stories. I started my research on William Finley almost 40 years ago, so I was very lucky to encounter a lot of people like Tom who knew Finley, and that was William Finley Jr. and Herman Bohlman's son, Captain Ted Bohlman, and especially Ruth Zentbauer. Ruth Zentbauer and her husband, who owned Jansen knitting mills, bought the Finley house from Irene. And unfortunately, like William, Irene also suffered from dementia. And so when the Zentbauers bought the house from Irene, she literally was taken out of the house, I think put in a care facility, and everything was left there, including most of the movies that he took, which I subsequently put into the Oregon Historical Society and Oregon State University Historical Society. But the thing that I remember most when I was visiting with Ruth is she came out one day with this costume. And she says, you know, I can't figure out what William uses. He must have dressed it up for Halloween. And I looked at it and I went, oh my God, that's a ghost costume. So I gave that to the Horner Museum down in Corvallis, which subsequently closed, and it's in the Benton County Historical Society. So if you want to see William Finley's goat costume, you can go to Klamath and they'll show it to you.
We're working right now on hopefully having an exhibit about a year from now of Finley stuff, and we're working on getting that goat costume for a trip to Portland. Okay. So stay tuned, it might come.
One other thing, and I don't mean to be unpleasant because it's been a pleasant evening, but I heard Bob talk about that only 2% of expenditures for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife goes to non-game. Most of the funding for that department comes from hunters and fishermen, and nature lovers contribute almost zero to it. So it's just common sense. And some of the programs that the non-game has, let's take the western pond turtle, is exceedingly viable. But if non-hunters and non-fishermen aren't prepared to contribute to that department, that'll be at the low end of the budget. It's as simple as that. And the best example I can give you, I'm an avid member of the Audubon Society, Salem Audubon. My life list is at 541 now. I just got back from Arizona where I got to see 65 new species. I will go this coming Saturday to an Audubon bird watching trip. But a lot of the bird watching trips I've taken have been to Ankeny, Finley, and Basket Slough refuges, which were paid in great part through funds raised from the migratory bird stamp or duck stamp. And there's been several trips that I've been on that I've asked the other members, how many of you buy a duck stamp? And the answer was 0. So what I would plead with you is to spend the $25 that this duck stamp cost, or migratory bird stamp, and what you're going to do is 98% of that $25 is used to buy land for wildlife refuges. So, not to end it on an unpleasant note, but I'm preaching to you a little bit. And Bob just told me that he was one of the individuals that really was trying to promote a tax on bird seed, which is all important, which would go to the non-game fund. And according to Bob, the Democrats voted it down, which is a shame.
The Democrats didn't give it a hearing. It had bipartisan support.
Yeah. So anyhow, I want to thank you very much. I'll just add that when I wrote the book on Finley almost 30 years ago, it was published by Oregon State University Press, Portland Audubon had me for a book signing and a slide program on Finley's life, and 7 people showed up. And one of them was William Finley Jr. and his wife. So Portland Audubon said, well, something must have been wrong with the date. So they had me come back for a second time, and 9 people showed up. So you don't know how pleased I am to see all of you people, and I thank you very much.
So we went a little bit long, but we have some time for questions, and I'd really love to give you an opportunity to ask questions. We have a microphone, so raise your hands and we'll bring the microphone over to you. And we'll try and get as many questions in as we can. We have to be out of the building by 8:30, so we need to we can only get a couple questions in, but we'll do our best.
Yeah, so this question is for Mr. Mathewson. I'm curious about how you got Roger Torrey Peterson to do your foreword, and the second part of that is, are there any other contemporary folks, photographers, etc., who you found in your research that have been inspired by William Finley?
Well, you know, getting Peterson to do the foreword was a real stroke of luck. That was all the work of Joe Alexander at the press. She was suggesting somebody that might do a foreword for it, and I says, well, I'm sure Peterson, when he started out in his career, was aware of Finley, and you might contact him, and Joe did, and so that's how he wrote the foreword to the book. But Finley made a big impression on a lot of people during those days.
Has anyone written a book about Irene Finley?
No, that's interesting, you know, because Irene stepped in. You know, let me clear something up. There's been some talk that Bohlman and Finley had a falling out, which was not the case. In 1908, Bohlman married, went into his father's plumbing business and was, you know, very busy and just didn't have the time. The only other time that Bohlman was with Finley was in 1912 when Dallas Lore Sharp came out and Finley joined that expedition. But Irene sort of stepped in and took over in Bohlman's place. So a lot of the photographs were actually taken by Irene, even though she had 2 young children to raise. So she gets a lot of credit.
But none in writing yet, so.
Well, she after Finley became, let's put it politely, disabled, Irene was still writing magazine articles up until 1947, 48. That about right, Tom? Yeah, by herself.
One cool thing when you go through the archives is Finley took an amazing number of pictures of Irene with birds perched on her. Wherever they went, there were birds perching on Irene, whether in Arizona, Oregon, California. Going into the subway in Boston, they have pictures of the subway, and our birds are perched on top of Irene. She was kind of a bird magnet.
We got something important here.
There's a book by the Finleys that hasn't even been mentioned, and it was rediscovered in the files, which in years past were kind of a jumble up at Audubon, and it was the layout for a book, and the Society published it, and it was Blue Birds 7, a children's book, and that was a great success at its time. Bluebirds 7.
By Bruce Horsfall.
By Bruce Horsfall. Yeah. And
I have a question. I was wondering how they were able to get so close to the birds.
Which one of you wants to take that one?
Tom, you want to do that?
what was that?
How were they able to get so close to the birds? They climbed up there.
They put on bird costumes.
On a more serious note, I mean, they did things like they'd put metronomes out so the birds would get used to the clicking for the shutter so they wouldn't scare away. They also strategically targeted the nests as the site of a lot of their photography because it's a place they're always going to come back to, and patience. They would be out there for days and weeks at a time to get that one picture. So the birds got used to them, but really
I
patience.
will point out one photograph that's always caught my attention, and they showed it tonight. That's when Finley and Bohlman are up on top of a dug fir photographing a western tanager's nest. And that's an amazing feat to get up that high in the tree with that big heavy camera and tripod. So they went to a lot of effort and a lot of danger. In fact, Finley fell down in California, I think in 1905, and injured himself pretty bad trying to get up a cliff to photograph whatever bird it was. And one final thing, there's been thousands of photographs taken of California condors. But I don't think, in my estimation, there was ever a better photograph ever taken than Herman Bohlman took in 1906 of the pair of California condors sitting on a dead snag. That's just a real grabber.
How did they get the condor? Did they raise it from a chick? Or?
No, what happened, Bohlman was up in Portland still, and Finley was finishing up his college career in California. And Joseph Grinnell, famous ornithologist, knew where the condors were nesting. And so he took Finley up to the eyrie site, and Finley actually photographed the condor chick that was cracking out of the egg. And subsequently, Bohlman came down for a month and a half or 2 months, where incidentally he met his wife Maud, his future wife Maud, during that period. And they spent a lot of time up around the condors, and they decided, and I'm not sure why, when the condor was just about fledged, they decided to take it. One of their concerns were, at that time, oologists, the tremendous hobby of collecting eggs and bird skins, were rampaging. And a condor skin was worth, in 1906, about $500. So you can figure out what that is in today's money. And they were afraid that these collectors had followed them up to the eyrie site. So they took the condor chick, and Finley moved back to Jennings Lodge in the summer of 1906, and they brought the condor with him. And he later gave it to William Hornaday of the New York Zoological Society, their zoo in New York. And it lived there for a number of years, and then somebody threw a rubber band in the cage, and the condor was named General, and it swallowed the rubber band and died due to that. 2 weeks after they took the condor chick out there, a couple of collectors had been successful in following them, and they shot both the adults.
So I think we can do one more question. I'm really sorry that we didn't end up having quite enough time as I wanted at the end for questions, so I'll let Shauna be the person who picks.
So this question is for Bob. What do you see going forward as specific threats to the work? You know, I'm thinking of David Brower's quote, all of our victories are temporary and all of our losses are permanent. And it appears we're in the midst of a struggle today. And then you were mentioning in 2023, there'll be the possibility of creation of new refuges. So what can we do specifically today to follow in the advocacy work and the accomplishments of Mr. Finley, his wife, his friends, you, all?
No, I appreciate the question. And by the way, Chris is here from Friends of Malheur, and Chris wanted me to express their thanks to everyone who came out and supported Malheur, and we also at Portland Audubon want to express our thanks. You know, I think we saw how a community can stand up to that kind of a threat a year ago, and people speaking out is incredibly important. And right now, the politics in this country are unlike anything we've seen in a very, very long time, maybe ever, in terms of hostility toward the environment, toward public lands, toward wildlife, and toward undoing the framework that's been put in place since the early 1970s to protect our lands, our water, our air, and our wildlife. So I think, you know, one is get involved. Get involved with your local conservation groups, go to hearings, write letters, speak out on behalf of these issues. We need to make our voices heard and make them heard louder than we've made them heard before. So I think there are threats at the federal level in terms of undoing the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, rolling back those protections, undoing protections for public lands. We're working on those issues with a lot of other groups, trying to figure out how to prevent the undoing of that framework that has served us very, very well. I think also getting involved at the local level as well, because right now where we're going to make progress is on the local level. One of the reasons I like working for Portland Audubon is we work at the local, state, and federal level. And while we're fighting rollback at the federal level, we have a chance to move forward at the state level and at the municipal level. And we've seen that recently with the fossil fuel work that's been done in Portland. The banning of new fossil fuel facilities a year ago, the commitment to go completely renewable by 2050 that was passed a week ago, you know, where the federal government doesn't lead, the state and cities can. And so get involved at the local level and let's make some progress even during these difficult and dark times. And finally, I think working at your own local neighborhood level, you know, make a difference in your own backyard. I think there's nothing more satisfying than actually getting out and you know, restoring your neighborhood, access to nature, having our kids grow up and understand the importance of being surrounded by nature and protecting the things that we have immediately within our control. So I think at all three of those levels. And again, you know, we have a sign-up sheet out in the lobby. Please do get involved because we need everybody's voice right now.
Right.
And Worth says to buy duck stamps. And I will second that.
So on that note, I'm really sorry that we didn't have time for everyone's questions, but we have to be out of the building by a certain time. So I'm going to say thank you again for coming. It's wonderful to see so many people here and excited about Finley and his legacy and this project. And I'll just put a final plug for we have surveys in the back, or if you put your name on an email address on the sign-in sheet, we will email you a survey. And we'd really appreciate you filling those out. This project is funded federally, and so we want to show the people in Washington, D.C. that we're using their money well. So thank you.